Welcome to the SIWIKE Podcast, the only podcast that shares the stuff you didn't know you needed to know about jobs, careers, and life. The SIWIKE Podcast, the stuff I wish I knew earlier.
Hi everyone, and welcome to the SIWIKE Stuff I Wish I Knew Earlier podcast. We're here again with our guest host, Andrea Lo, and we thought we'd have an interesting conversation of what to do after being laid off. So, Andrea, how are you doing today?
I'm doing great. Getting over a cold, so hopefully I don't cough during this podcast, but thank you for having me back on the show.
It's a pleasure. And then we were talking off air, and you mentioned that in your history you had the auspicious milestone of being laid off. It's one of those things that many people do go through, and it can be a very challenging and trying time for folks. So I'd love if you kind of set the stage in terms of the context of that story, and then we really want to give folks some advice in terms of what to do afterwards. So how did it start in terms of the layoff story? So if you can give us some context, that would be great.
Yeah, for sure. It happened, I think two and a half years ago now, actually during the pandemic. So I think I wasn't alone in that. Many of us got laid off during the pandemic. So as a reminder, I was in marketing. I worked for a marketing agency. And as you know, during the pandemic, one of the industries that got affected by the pandemic was events. All events came to a full stop because we're not going out, we're on lockdown, and so no events were happening, so that really hurt our business. We were trying to, go virtual with all the events, but nonetheless, it still impacted the business. So, I think by the end of it, over half the staff at my agency were laid off, and I unfortunately was part of the third, cohort of layoffs, unfortunately. And so, I had been working at that agency for 8 years, so a pretty good chunk of my career. And I think through that 8 years, I really helped I established a lot of the policies that still exist there today. I saw a lot of the processes. I did a lot for that company. So I was a very loyal employee. So, you really didn't think, especially seeing that by that time I was a third cohort. I didn't know at the time, but it was like, oh, wow, like I got saved another round, or it wasn't me because I'm, working so hard. And I was I would say I was one of the pivotal members that were trying to take the company to do virtual events, because I was one of the more tech savvy people. So I was doing all the research and even, pitching the business to clients. Like, I was a pivotal member. So to be honest, I felt like I set the company up for success into the new age of virtual, and then unfortunately I got laid off. So It definitely sucks. I'm sure anyone who got laid off will tell you that it burns, it sucks, it's definitely a hit to your ego. So that's what happened.
Sounds good. I'd love you kind of walk us through kind of maybe I don't know if you can remember, like the day of, the day after, that sort of thing. So pandemic, there was a lot of things that are happening. So you got through 1 round, 2 rounds, and then, oh my goodness, right? Like what was like the day like that you received it? The typical thing is they walk you into a room, HR is in there, and then, I don't know, they give you a box. Is that sort of what happened, or is there a different thing that happened?
Yeah, so I guess because of the pandemic and we were working from home, it was different in that sense. So it's not like you get called into the room. However, I guess the sign was, you got this, I think the telling sign, was you got this invite. I think mine was, it was with like one of the senior leaders, and there was our HR person. And at the time, the company had, the HR person was like on contract, right? So we'd never really see this HR person. So the fact that she was on the, invite for the meeting, I was like, well, I'm pretty sure I'm not going to be promoted. I'm not sure why this HR person's here or if I'm in trouble. So I'm like, I think it's going to be my turn. So then the meeting happened, and then it was happening. I was like, oh no, it's happening. And you're just in shock, to be honest. Like I usually like I have like a poker face kind of thing when that's sort of maybe that's my defense mechanism, like where I'm just really like, you can't, if you read my face, you're like, you can't tell if I'm upset or happy or just, it's like kind of neutral. And then I was just like, okay, like they're like, do you have any questions? Like, no, I'll just wait for the letter and we'll go from there. Like I was just like kept it professional. And then of course after I hung up, that's when I was like, what the F? Like, what's going on? Like, I can't believe it. And then you're like, okay, do I tell anyone? Am I allowed to tell anyone? So, of course, I told my closest friends. I told my family. And then I'm a very methodical, analytical person. So just 100 questions came into my head, right? Like, of like, okay, so what do I do? What are the processes? Who do I ask? Let me talk to my HR friend. Like, I was just going nuts in a way of like, okay, how do I wasn't thinking about like, okay, I'm going to overturn this decision. I was just like, what are the next steps? Like, I don't know. Like, should I talk to someone who got laid off? Should I talk to an HR person? So I spent my next like day or two, because I'm such a problem solver, I was focused more on, okay, what now versus like, I'm going to deal with my feelings later, right? Like, I'm not going to cry about it. I'm not going to like, let's deal with the feelings later. Let's like shove that down somewhere deep for now. And let's just deal with what are the next steps, right? And so that's what I did. But my closest coworkers were definitely shocked. They're like, really? Like, Andrea, you're like the most loyal employee. You like have done so much for the company. Like, I would think you're the last person that they would ever lay off. I had the same thoughts, but such is life. And so, but it, you know, it certainly helped from a emotional standpoint when I had the capacity to, you know, accept it and deal with it. It certainly helped that I had such a, you know, good network of friends and family that were supportive, that were, you know, there to, you know, console me and comfort me. But I will say, like, until you are the one who got laid off, because again, during the pandemic, a lot of people were laid off, right? It was sort of, at that point, I was sort of on the other end trying to console other people, right? And so until it happens to you, like, you don't know how it feels like. So as much as you're trying to be sympathetic, empathetic, you really don't know how it is until you're in that seat. And that's one of the lessons I learned, where I'm like, okay, if I could do this again, what would I say to that other person if they were laid off or they lost their job? Because it's a huge shock, like, especially for me, like, being there for 8 years and most of my career. Emotionally, it felt like I lost a limb. Like, it was like ego, like, was shot. Like, I was just drained. Like, I was just like, I was lost. I was like, what am I doing with my life at this point? Like, because that's what I know. That's what I knew. That's where I had been putting all my time and energy. And I was working throughout my career there, especially because it's events, and I became a senior manager by the end of it, 60 to 80 hours of work. It really was my life, right? So when that is all of a sudden taken away from you, and that's what you know, you're lost, you're puzzled, you're angry, you have a lot of emotions to deal with.
Thanks for sharing that. I know it's a very difficult time for many, and I'm reminded of someone else I was chatting with as well who got laid off, and they were top performing, like highest rating, so it reminds me of that. And then the company decided to basically divest that whole business, and they didn't even want to sell it. They just said, no, let's get rid of it. So a whole bunch of people got laid off. And obviously the pandemic is a very specific case where it happened to a lot of folks. So but to your point, that until it actually happens to you, it is quite a loss, and it is, from what I've heard, like a sense of mourning, right? You lost a loved one, you lost a limb, as you mentioned, and so it can be trying. So there's tons of emotions there, and I'd love if you kind of walk through some of the things that you went through. So obviously you connected with folks and had a great support network, so that's definitely one. Are there other things that you would kind of suggest to yourself, or maybe going back and doing it a little different? Are there other things that you said, like, I wish I would have done this kind of in the days, weeks after that, in order to deal with the emotions? And then maybe it was that whole problem solver attitude. It's like, I'm going to deal with emotions later. I'm going to focus on keeping myself busy. So what were some the pieces of advice that you give yourself if you could go kind of back in time?
Yeah, I mean, so I guess let's first talk about the the admin side of it, which, I don't think too many people talk about, or maybe we're not supposed to talk about, but dealing with the sort of the layoff, which is like the termination letter and then the process thereafter. And I think not enough is talked about this, and so that's why I want to talk about the sort of admin legal side of it first. And it's really that before you sign any paperwork, and as much as you're like, okay, like I want to be done with this and I want to, like get this over with, or maybe sometimes you felt like you don't have, there's only one option, sign it and then be done with it, right? With any letter, even if you got a job offer, right? Same thing. It's read the letter, read all the terms, because I know a lot of people just sign. It's like you're signing a letter or life away, you don't know what you signed, right? So I just encourage people to, if it happens to you, like, and again, there's a lot of emotions happening. So that's why I said I'm going to shove it aside. And that's just kind of how I am, because I'm very analytical and methodical. I'm like, I gotta like read this letter, like literally word for word, and I want to know if there are clauses in there that I don't like, or that anything, like, is this benefiting me? Am I getting everything that I deserve in this package or whatever? Like, you want to make sure, because again, this is like end of life for you, at the end of term for you at this company. So you want to know, especially if like your friend who is the top performing, is what that's happening. Like, is this, what am I getting, what I deserve or what I'm entitled to legally? And because we don't go into a job thinking I'm going to be laid off or terminated, so I need to think about what those terms are. No, because you're thinking like, I'm never going to leave this company, or I'm going to leave on my own terms. So you're not thinking about what am I deserving at this point? What am I legally entitled to when you're laid off? So I had to do research, right? And you're given a certain like deadline to sign it. So I went through, like I said, I talked to some of my HR friends, right, who deal with, hiring and firing of terminations and layoffs. So I wanted to double check that. I, of course, use Google. I also then talked to some of my lawyer friends who deal with employment contracts, or to refer me to sort of the employment sort of lawyers and highly referred people who deal with this, because I wanted to make sure this termination letter was, it benefits me, and it's looking out for my best interests, and there's no clauses that are like tricky. I just maybe have trust issues, but I'm like, okay, I just really need to do my due diligence here. And I don't know if this is a lot, but I ended up talking, or like, when you go for like a consultation, or just to see if you're getting the same advice or the best advice, I went through 9 like legal sort of consultations.
Wow. Okay.
And through that process, and if you've ever looked for legal help, like the pricing ranges, right? And I know we all like to watch Netflix Suits, right? And you're thinking like lawyers are cool and all of this, but like when you actually need their help, it's expensive, like an hour of their time. And plus you're like, do I want the top dog's time, or do I want the junior person? And do I trust the junior person? You know what I mean? In real life, there's a lot of decisions and criteria that you need to think about. So I went through 9 sort of legal companies to figure out like, okay, this is what I want to do. And so, is there negotiating? Do I need to like send out a counter offer? Like, it was very stressful. To be honest, I think it took almost a month or a little bit more. And I kept delaying the deadline to signing. I was like, I don't, this part, I don't like this line. I don't like this line in this letter. I was very nitpicky, because again, you have one shot. If you sign it, it's done, right? The people in that third cohort that I was talking about, apparently they all signed like within that week. And I was like, no, I'm going to take my time. Like, I have nothing to lose at this point, because, you're thinking, again, this is your last shot to make any changes if you don't like that letter. And I went through 9 legal sort of consultations to figure out which sort of route I'm going with and what I want to do, and what I'm entitled to. So by the end of it, I was happy with that. I had a good break in terms of, and that break was important for me to deal with that other half. So once that letter was signed, it was like a huge sigh of relief. And then it was like, okay, now time to actually deal with what is going on emotionally. So in hindsight, would I recommend, shoving your emotions down for like a month? And it's not that I didn't deal with it for a month. It was just not on my priority, because at that point, you're kind of kicking into high gear of like, let's focus on one thing. And that one thing is, am I signing this letter, or am I countering offering? What am I doing with it on a legal standpoint? That was my first sort of priority. And then it was like in between here and there. Of course, people were checking in on me. I was, trying to deal with my emotions, because it was a stressful time, right? Like I said, even as you're dealing with the legal matter, right? You are dealing with like your ego shot, right? Because if you're thinking you're a high performing member and you're like, it's not going to be me. Well, it is you this time. So you got to deal with like, okay, why me? Because that's going to be one of the big questions. I'm sure your friend also thought of it. Why me? Out of all people, there were still, 10 other people to choose from. Why me? You go through this whole thing of like, well, that person was like this. And afterwards, but when you hear yourself, you're like, seriously, Andrea? Is that what you're thinking right now? That it should have been that person and not you? Like, it's honestly such negativity, right? Because when everything is cool, you would never say, like, I'm better than that person and it should have been that person and not you. Like, you're not thinking straight. Your emotions are getting the better of you. So it really took, I'm not good at this. I'm still not good at this. Meditation, right? Journaling, and again, during the pandemic, not all the gyms were open. So I couldn't even be like, let me go punch, like, go boxing and do this. Like, right? You're trying to do everything you can, because it was in the heart of the whole lockdowns and things, right? So not everything was open again. So you're like, okay, well, I guess I'll try to walk outside and I'll try to do this. Like, you're sort of racking your brain on like, what can I do that's healthy for me dealing with my emotions in the lack of options available for you to your normal outlets, right? Like, I'm like, oh, let me go do yoga, let me go boxing and punch a punching bag instead of the wall, all the things. Sure. You're like, let me release this toxic energy, and to be honest, let me throw in some even more challenges through that. The boyfriend at the time broke up with me.
Oh no.
So one of my support pillars kind of, goodbye, that. And at the time, in the heart of the lockdowns, because my Asian family being super strict, and I don't live with them, and if they're like, if you don't want to be part of our like bubble of 5, then sorry, you're on your own. So as much as I said I do have a good support network, the usual partners and pieces that you would turn to, so if you're dating someone, you have a partner, and then your family, in that sense, physically and emotionally, like, they weren't there. And so to me, it was a very trying time of, okay, career, you lost direction on that, right? Your love life, you're like, okay, great, that ended. Family, oh, okay, so I don't want to, live in their bubble, so they're kind of picking me out, right? So it was a really trying time for me. I would definitely say one of my lowest points in life, not going to deny that. And so you really had to get creative and really dig deep on like, okay, Andrea, are you going to admit defeat? Are you going to cry about it and talk about it, all of it? Which at one point I did, it's like the ugly crying, whatever you can do to like, stress eat, whatever it is that we turn to. But I had to get really creative of, okay, so life gave you lots of lemons. Let's make some lemonade, right? But you had to turn to all your close friends, right? I was like going through my phone list of like, okay, who do I want to talk to? Who do I think is going to be there for me? And honestly, it was a good, it's a time in your life when you're like, this is when your real, true, genuine friends and, people in your life are going to show and reveal themselves. So it was a really, reflective and interesting time in my life too, because some people who like you didn't think were really that close to you or really cared, came out, from the shadows, like, oh wow, like, and all of a sudden I was like, wow, you know what? As much as it's a shitty time, I realized, like, wow, there's some incredible, amazing people in my life, and maybe I've forgotten it, or maybe I was so busy with work and all this other stuff that I lost sight of that. And so it was a time when you're like, okay, yes, it is shitty, but let's try and look on the bright side. And I know that's so cliche to say, look at the positive side, look at all these things, but really, it's what you will hold on to. It's what got me through.
Right. That's amazing. Thanks for sharing. And definitely sounds like a very trying time. And obviously, next time that happens, feel free to contact me. Maybe I'll come out of the shadows and help out. But for that, I would love if you can pinpoint it. Was there like a turning point to say, like, okay, ugly crying, stress eating, all that sort of stuff, and then finally realize, okay, this is my time to turn those lemons into lemonade, right? Was there a particular conversation or a particular time at the gym or a particular something? And it's probably a bunch of lead up, because you have to deal with a lot of stuff, and then eventually you're at the point where, you know what, I can actually deal with it. But I don't know if you can recall, was there a moment that kind of helped you, okay, now I'm on the upswing?
I feel like part of the thing that turned around was, honestly, like, as soon as I signed the paperwork, because honestly it was dreadful, because anytime you have to deal with, like, lawyers and legal stuff, especially, right. I'm someone who, like, I like to be in control of things. So when there's unknown, unplanned factors, it really stresses me out. And so there was a lot of, like, unknowns and unfamiliar territory, right? So, because I've never been laid off before, I didn't really have to deal with lawyers before, and, it was unfamiliar territory, and the feelings that, like, it was just, so as soon as that was signed, and I was like, okay, we can move on now. Now what do I do? Now what do I do with this free time, right? Free time. And honestly, it was, like I said, I had been working, for over a decade, but, like, the last 8 years at that point was 60, 80 hours a week. That's the life I knew. So all of a sudden you're like, whoa, all this free time. Like, I could wake up whenever. I could do whatever. I could be lazy. It was just not in my vocabulary, but that sort of, like, the signing of the paperwork was sort of like, it's almost like a milestone in a way of, like, okay, that's the end. Like, that is done with. Now I get to, like, live this next phase of my life, whatever it is. I had no idea what I was going to do, but there was some relief to that, because you're just like, okay, that part's gone, now I can do whatever. And through being able to have time to reflect, and I didn't realize at the time, when you're so caught up, and, in this day and age, we're so, like, we're one-upping each other on, like, how busy we are, which is insane to think about, like, but that's people's thing these days, like, oh, I'm so busy doing this. Oh, what are you busy with? Oh, I'm doing this. You're like in this competition of, like, who's busier, who has more important priorities. And when that happened, when I had all this free time, I was like, oh my god, this is so weird. But in a way, it was so refreshing. And I forgot to mention, right before being laid off, I actually experienced burnout, like, for real burnout. Because the thing is, a lot of us, and including myself, always sort of talked about, like, burnout, like, it was always, like, a foreign thing. Yeah, I've heard about people burning out. It's not going to be me. Same thing. It's not going to be me. I'm like invincible, and I'm like, I'm such a, superwoman. I can do all those things. And, but there was a certain point, and this is how I knew it was burnout. I was reading up about it, and we actually had a person come in to actually talk about burnout, because a lot of us were experiencing it. And then that's when I learned that I was in moderate burnout, like medium stage. And I remembered, and this is how I knew, because I would say I'm good at my job. I would remember opening an Excel spreadsheet, like something like, schedule, something I could do, in my sleep backwards, like whatever. I would literally open the spreadsheet and I would cry and be like, I'm, like, stressed out about it. I know how to do it. I don't want to do it. And I was just stressing out about the smallest details. I was on edge. I was sort of getting into, like, these little, like, wouldn't say fights, but tension with your coworkers or your managers when usually you don't. So when I read the description, when it was explained to me, I was like, oh, that's what I'm going through right now. It was burnout.
Right.
And so that's why when I had all this free time, and all of a sudden you had time and energy to breathe, to just be, to not have a set schedule, that I was like, wow, like I felt like a different me kind of came out. And that's when I had time to go, all right, let's go make some lemonade. And so I channeled that energy into starting my now business, which is Toronto Dating Hub. And it was through having, so I guess I'm not sure about, certain one point. It was just more of a stage of that I just had the time and energy all of a sudden to think outside the box, to be creative again, right? Because I didn't have a set schedule. Like here's, back then when I was burning out, in your 8-hour day, I had 12 hours of work and 8 hours of meetings. You know what I mean?
Right.
And so all of a sudden when you have no meetings, you're like, wait a second, like I could, like meditate or go out on my balcony and just look outside, or like take walks or eat whenever I want, watch, marathon Netflix all I want. But all of a sudden I was like, you know what, I'm going to channel all this negative energy and the tribulations that I went through. And I was able to identify, because at that time, like I said, I had lost a boyfriend. My family sort of kind of kicked me outside their bubble. And I was like, I'm feeling so isolated and alone right now. What are other singles feel like? Like, what are other people? I mean, not saying other people had to be laid off, but I'm like, what are other people feeling? And so I was able to identify this community of singles, isolated singles, that in the time of desperation and need, which is during the pandemic, who is serving us right now? Who is really looking out for us? And there were no events. And if anyone was like me, or even worse, like they live alone, they don't, maybe for other people who are more shy and introverted, they don't have as many friends. And again, we were on lockdown. No one was serving this community. And I said, wait a second, I know how to do virtual events. I know how to do events. I know how to do marketing. I have a lot of time on my hands. Holy crap. Let's start doing singles events. And so that's how Toronto Dating Hub was born. And all of a sudden I was able to sort of start channeling my time and energy into something that I thought was, if I could serve the singles community, because I know how lonely and terrifying and confusing and aggravating this feels like to be single during the pandemic, and no one was helping us. I was going to be that solution.
Right. That's amazing. And again, thanks again for kind of reliving the moment and the challenging times. And what comes to me based on the recount that you had is, there's a quote that I like is, this too shall pass, right? So as crappy as things may be right now, just like any storm with anything, it'll pass. And as you were kind of going through your story, a couple things that I would suggest for folks in order to help someone that is going through this, and tell me if you have anything else to add, but is one, to deal with the administration, because that stuff, I mean, just got to be dealt with. And then for you specifically, it was a good kind of milestone, like checkpoint to say, okay, done, now let's move on. Turning to friends or whatever support structure you have, so partners, family, and this and that, depending on what's available to you, then making sure to reach out, because oftentimes it's that isolation and all that really gets to you, versus you realize that you probably kind of, I'm thinking of one of the banks, like you're richer than you think in terms of like social network. There's usually someone that comes out of the woodwork, and taking some time to process your emotions, be it yoga, gym, whatever, punching walls, this and that, or meditating and whatever it is, find what that release is, and then taking some time to find out what's new with you, right? So now that you were in this past life, what do you want to do? So be it serving singles in events and things like that. So those are some of the things that I took from the conversation. Are there any other things that you'd want to add or tell Andrea kind of just after the signing of the paper, or even before that? What are some other things that you might want to share with Andrea at that point?
You're always great at summarizing. You hit it on bang on. Because I know, like, sometimes I can drown on. I'm like, you're so great at that. So, yeah, that's really great. I think there's 2 points that I want to, as you sort of recounted what I said, 2 things that came to mind. I think I mentioned that until you sort of in those shoes, you don't know how it really feels like. So in hindsight now, if someone were to go through something like a layoff, termination, firing, whatever hardship is, and it doesn't have to be about employment, but what I heard a lot, and in hindsight, I think it's because people don't know how to deal with it. They don't know what to say. What I heard a lot was, oh, like, you know, that sucks. Like, it's happening to a lot of people. Like, it's happening to, like, because in that moment, like, on the receiving end, I don't, to be honest, like, selfishly, because of what I'm feeling, I don't give a shit about other people at that moment. Like, so what if, yes, I get it, I'm one of, like, thousands of people that got laid off, but I'm not them. I'm, like, feeling crappy, so telling me that other people got laid off and I'm one of them, and it's so common, everyone's doing it, it's sort of, it doesn't validate our feelings, and it certainly doesn't help the situation. And so I think a better way, if you want to, you know, I know they're trying to comfort you, and they're thinking by saying, like, you know, it's happening to everyone, and it's like, you know, like, you're not alone. I think it's usually our default way, and I'm guilty. Like, when I hadn't been laid off, that's probably something I would say. And I would just say, like, you know, definitely, like, if you're really close to your friend, you might know what they need. So, and I know there's a popular, like, you know, love languages, but it's like, what is it that they need? They need a big bear hug? Do they need, you know, an Uber Eats meal sent to them? Take care of themselves? You know, do you need to be their punching bag? Whatever it is, but that is actually going to be even more helpful. Or even simply, like, that sucks, and stop. What do you need? What can I do for you? Right? Instead of, like, trying to offer, because sometimes, like, we don't want unsolicited advice, because sometimes the advice might come across as, like, for example, right, like, my parents might say something like, well, I think you should do this, this, and this, and this, and I'm like, maybe I don't agree, but also, like, why are you telling me how I should do what I should do at this point when you don't know what's going on, right? And so that's why I'm saying, stop for a second to maybe not give unsolicited advice, because at that time, it may not be what that person needs. And so if you don't know what they need, simply just ask, hey, no, that sucks. That really sucks. I can't imagine what you're going through right now. What do you need from me? What can I do for you? Leave it at that. Wait for them to talk, and because maybe they just need to rant. Maybe they need a shoulder to cry on. Maybe they don't need anything. So I'm just saying, sometimes the unsolicited advice really actually counter, like, it will backfire. So I'm just letting people know if you ever encounter, and that, honestly, it's not just about terminations. I think a lot of people, when they're troubled, that's what we want to hear. And so that's something that came to mind. And the other note is just, if this happens to you, or again, if you're going through something trying, take as much time as you need. I mean, I had a deadline of when I needed to sign the letter, but actually one of the advice was given was, like, they can set whatever timeline, but you don't need to, like, take it. You can say, I need more time to go through this letter and go through what I need to do. So, you know, counter and say whatever time. But not even just the legal stuff. If you need months to get over it, because to be honest, you're right, it is something you're mourning. You're mourning like a big chunk of your life. I talked to my therapist, right? She's like, you're going through grief. This is grief. And grief is a big emotion and part that is challenging to deal with. It's not a light thing. And so that's another thing. You don't take it for what it is. It's not a small part, especially, again, for me. I was working there for 8 years. It's a huge part of my career. So take as much time as you need to process it, to get over it. Because as, you know, even with breakups, if you don't process it properly, it's going to haunt you, and it's going to manifest, but not in a great way, if you don't deal with it properly and appropriately.
That's amazing. I love what you said. I mean, such easy advice. That sucks. What do you need? I mean, something as simple as that can be so profound and helpful for someone, because, to your point, yeah, they might not want anything. They just want to, like, use you as a punching bag, a verbal punching bag for a little bit, and then the energy is released, and then now you can move on. And then taking that time, because is it a month? Is it 6 months? Is it a year? Is it whatever? Like, everybody's slightly different, right? So some people might say, "Oh, you should be over it by now." Well, maybe not, because I'm slightly different, or circumstances were different, and you had kind of a perfect storm of things happen. So it's not just one thing; it's multiple, and another one, and another one, and another. So I'm glad that you're also sharing that it's different for everyone. So just because there is a deadline, artificial or not, and just make sure that you take the time. So thanks so much for Andrea for joining us and sharing some wisdom, some SWIKE on what to do after you've been laid off. And are there any other parting words that you'd have for folks that are going through a layoff or other trying times? I know you already provide some great advice, but just in case you can think of anything at the moment.
Yeah, no, honestly, if you're watching this, now or later, I'm sure you'll share my contact information. Honestly, especially to those who feel they don't have anyone in their corner, or a lot of us have pride and we don't want to tell anyone how we're really truly feeling. If that happens to you, honestly, reach out to me, because I've been there. And if you need advice, which lawyer should I go to, any advice, or you just want to talk to someone, honestly, reach out to me.
Sounds good. So Andrea's got a good Rolodex of folks to reach out to. So thanks again, Andrea, for sharing your advice, and hopefully we'll have you back for a future episode.
Thank you. I'd love to. Thank you so much.
Take care.
Thanks for joining us on the SWIKE Stuff I Wish I Knew Earlier, the podcast. If you like the podcast, please subscribe on iTunes, Stitcher, or wherever you found this podcast. And if you can give us a review, that would be very appreciated. Feel free to contact me on LinkedIn at Lukidanu, Lukidanu, and the same on most social media platforms. And I look forward to hearing from you. Thanks. Bye.